Hey everyone, this is Matt with FlightTrajectory.com. I've had a lot of requests from you guys for teaching you how to land an airplane, so without further ado, here is Lesson 11. So, before we start talking about actually landing the plane, we need to talk a little bit about flying the traffic pattern. Every airport you go to, you're going to enter the traffic pattern prior to landing, and I'll explain that a little more in the next slide, but first let's talk about pattern altitude. We're going to be on the ground at Benton Harbor, Michigan, runway 28. That's where we'll depart. We're going to climb up to 1,000 feet AGL, which stands for above ground level. Now, your altimeter is going to read MSL, which stands for mean sea level. If you look down here, this is an excerpt from airnav.com. You can get a lot of useful airport information. The elevation at Benton Harbor is 649 feet MSL. So if you're on the ground at Benton Harbor, your altimeter will read 649. Now, pattern altitude is 1,000 feet above ground level, so you just add 1,000 to 649, which gets you to 1,649 feet, and then we just round it up to the next 100 feet. So we're going to fly the pattern at 1,700 feet MSL. Here's a diagram showing you what the normal traffic pattern looks like. Standard pattern is left-hand turns, and it's just a rectangle around the runway. Now, each leg has a specific name for it. So after you take off, we're going to fly the upwind. So it's parallel to the runway. We basically maintain runway heading and climb upwind. Then when we make our first left turn, that's called the crosswind leg. Make another left turn, that's the downwind leg, and that will parallel the runway. Then finally you're going to turn base 90 degrees, and then your last 90-degree turn is your turn to final. Now, let's talk about altitudes a little bit. So, on the upwind, fly runway heading, and you're going to climb to 700 foot AGL. So again, add that to your altimeter. That's going to be about 1,400 feet. You're going to turn crosswind. From there, we keep climbing all the way up to pattern altitude in the crosswind, and then we turn downwind. By the time we turn downwind, you should be at pattern altitude, and when you turn is simply a question of how wide of a pattern you want to fly, how far away your downwind is from your runway. In the downwind, we're shooting for about 90 knots airspeed. We'll be at 1,700 feet MSL. That's on our altimeter. And then before landing, we always do a pre-landing checklist, which we use the acronym GMS, which is just gas, verify it's on the fullest tank, mixture, you're going to adjust full rich for landing, and switches on. You would turn your fuel pump on and your landing light on, or whatever the operating handbook tells you to do in that instance. Now, once we're abeam the end of the runway here in the downwind, that's where we reduce our power. Usually about 1,500 RPM is a good setting. When you're in the white arc on the airspeed indicator, you'll add your first notch of flaps. In the Cessna, that's 10 degrees. And then we start a 500 foot per minute descent. You should be around 85 to 90 knots during this period. Now, you're going to descend 200 feet. So you're going from 1,700 MSL down to 1,500 MSL. With a 500 foot a minute descent, that'll mean that you'll be at 800 AGL when you're at about a 45 degree angle to the end of the runway, and I'll show you this in Flight Simulator when we get there. So then you're going to turn base. As you turn base, you're going to add your next notch of flaps, which is 20 degrees in the Cessna, slowing to about 80 knots, give or take. And you're going to keep your descent going at about 500 foot per minute, and then you will turn final when you're at 500 foot AGL is your altitude for turning final. So 500 AGL is going to be 1,200 MSL. As you turn final, add your final notch of flaps. That'll be 30 degrees. You should be at an airspeed of around 70 to 75 knots. Then we're slowing to about 65 knots for short final. Now, some airports have visual glide slopes. There's two basic types. There's PAPIs and there's VASIs. For a PAPI stands for Precision Approach Path Indicator, and it's the top right picture here. And it just gives you a visual indication using red and white lights as to whether or not you are high or low. Now, flying the pattern is all about airspeed control and altitude control. So knowing those airspeeds and those altitudes from the previous slide will help you tremendously in actually landing the plane. So a PAPI uses 4 lights in a row, and based on how many reds and how many whites there are indicates whether you are high on glide path or low. So if you turn final, you'll see it on the left hand side of the runway. 4 white lights means that you're too high. So if you start descending a little quicker, one of those lights will eventually turn red. So you have 3 white and 1 red light, which means you're slightly high. When you have 2 white and 2 red lights, that means you're on the glide path. If you see 3 reds, that means you're slightly low. So if you see three reds or 4 reds, which means you're way too low, you need to level off, maintain that altitude until those lights come back. So you need to decrease your rate of descent until the white lights start to appear again, and then you can continue your descent. Now, a VASI works pretty much the same, except a 2-bar VASI is the most common. There's actually multiple variations, but this is probably the most common, so it's what I'm going to talk about in the bottom right picture. The lights, they change 2 at a time, so all you'll either have 4 red lights, 2 reds and 2 whites, or all 4 white lights. But it works the exact same way. All 4 red lights means you are too low. Red and white means you're on glide path, and all 4 whites means that you're above the glide path. Now, not every runway or every airport actually has a VASI or a PAPI, which is why I talked about the altitudes in the previous slide. So if you remember, if nothing else that you take away from this, remember that 500 feet AGL is your altitude that you're going for before turning final. No lower, no higher. Shoot for 500 feet AGL. Add that to whatever the field elevation is, and you get your altitude that you should be at on your altimeter. So now that we've covered the pattern, we can talk about actually landing. Now when we come into land, what we're going to do is called a landing flare, and this is simply a maneuver to bleed off airspeed and touch down with the main gear first instead of the nose wheel. So if you look at this first picture here, we have an airplane coming in at 78 knots, and you can see that it has a nose low attitude, meaning that the nose is below the horizon, and you'll see that on your attitude indicator as well as just looking outside. If you come in, if he maintains this airspeed and this angle of attack, he's going to slam the nose wheel in first, which is not good for the plane. It's unstable and the plane's not done flying. You want to avoid driving the plane onto the ground, so to speak. So again, landing is almost entirely about airspeed control. Somewhere around here, as he's about to cross the runway, you want to bring the power to idle. And so at that point in time, you're no longer creating any thrust and your airspeed can start bleeding off. Now, the flare, basically you're going to increase your pitch attitude to hold the airplane off the ground until you slow down to such a speed that the plane is done flying. So you can think of the flare as just preventing the airplane from landing, and you're just holding it a few feet above the ground. So during this time we have no power, and lift is basically a function of angle of attack and airspeed. So as you're losing airspeed because your power is at idle, you need to increase the angle of attack by pulling back on the yoke. And so to maintain your airplane just a few feet off the ground, you're just going to add a little more back pressure, pull a little farther back on the yoke, pull back until your nose is actually a few degrees above the horizon and the airspeed slows down and the plane settles down onto the runway. So that's the landing flare. Once your main gear have touched down, you can apply braking and bring the airplane to a stop. Okay, so here we are on runway 28 at Benton Harbor. You can see my altimeter is reading about 660 feet MSL. We're flying up to a pattern altitude of 1,000 AGL, which will be 1,700 feet MSL on our altimeter. So when you're ready, release the brakes, apply full power, use your rudder to stay on the center line. Rotate at 55 knots. Is our VX speed, which is our best speed to clear obstacles. Time of above all obstacles now, so I can actually speed up, usually about 70 to 80 to be kind of our cruise climb setting. And it varies for every airplane. Now our runway heading is 275 degrees right there, so I just want to maintain that heading approximately as I'm climbing out. And remember, my altitude for turning crosswind is going to be 1,400 feet. So right there, I'm going to turn left to a heading of 180, actually 185. There's 1,700, so that's my pattern altitude. I'm going to lower the nose down to the horizon, keep my turn going. Start reducing power because I want to maintain 90 knots. There's a heading of 180. If I look out my left, I can see the runway there. And about over this highway is where I'm going to turn down. Rule of thumb, when you're in flying the traffic pattern, you don't want to bank any more than 30 degrees. So right now I'm in a 25-degree left bank, turning to a heading of about 095. And I'm way off my altitude. I need to be down at 1,700 feet. So if you haven't watched my lesson on trim, now would be a good time to do that. I need to trim the nose forward because the plane wants to climb on me. Now, coming up, beam my numbers. Right there. I'm going to bring my power back to 1,500 RPM. I need to slow down until my airspeed's in the white arc. That's the flap range. And add 10 degrees of flaps. Start a 500 foot a minute descent. You can see on my vertical speed indicator. I'm actually using a slightly lower power setting. I'm at 1,300 RPM right now because I was a little high. Come back, we can see the runway behind me. I'm going to start turning base here. That's at 1,500 MSL. Add in my second notch of flaps, 20 degrees. Speed 70, so that's looking good. Heading of 005. Take a look out to your left to find the runway. There it is, just hidden behind the wing strut. And my altitude for final is no lower than 1,200. Start turning final. Full flaps, 30 degrees. And you can see just to the left-hand side of the runway is that PAPI. And you can see there's 4 white lights right now, so that means I'm too high. So I need to increase my rate of descent. And you can see there's 1 red and 3 white, so I'm slightly high. Down 2 reds, 2 whites, that's what I want. Use about 500 foot a minute rate of descent. My airspeed's 65, so that's good. And I'm going to maintain that until I cross the end of the runway. Now, for lining up with the runway, if you just use your attitude indicator, look at how my attitude indicator is in line with the runway. That's a pretty good rate that will get you right where you want to be. For left and right alignment. People tend to want to line up the runway with the center of the airplane, and they end up chasing the runway left and right. So if you just aim for the attitude indicator to be in line with the center line of the runway, that'll work out pretty good for you. It's 60 knots. I'm a little bit high. I'm going to go go ahead and pull my power to idle now. And here I can start my landing flare. Actually getting slow, so I'm going to add just a touch of power. Idle. And brakes. Now that definitely wasn't a pretty landing, so I'm going to go ahead and try this again. Airspeed 65, my flaps are at 30 degrees. I'm a little bit high on the PAPI, so I'm increasing my rate of descent. My attitude indicator is lined up with the center line of the runway. And your goal when you're landing is you want to touch down on the center line at a minimum airspeed in a slightly nose-high attitude. That means that you've bled off your airspeed, the plane's done flying, and it's ready to settle down. Still a bit high, so I need to push forward on the yoke. Reds, 2 whites, I'm on the glide path. From here, about a 500 foot a minute descent rate will keep me there. 3 reds means I'm a little low. Now, the other thing with landing is you got to keep it slow, or mostly small movements. Try not to overcorrect, because you'll get out of hand and your landing will look like the last one I just did. 60 knots over the threshold. Power to idle. Nice and smooth. Add a little back pressure. Touching down slightly nose high. And there you have it. Brakes. Stay on the center line. And one more time for good luck. Full flaps, slowing to my approach speed a little bit high. Slightly high, 2 red, 2 white on glide path. 65 knots is what I'm shooting for. Over the end of the runway. Landing on the center line. Bring my power to idle. Start leveling off. Add some more back pressure, add some more. So there you have it, 3 mediocre landings, but you get the point. If you keep practicing that, honestly, that first landing, actually all 3 of them, I started the flare a little bit high, so you need to get a little bit closer to the runway before you start leveling off. Adding a little power can also help. You can add a little power, and that will extend your flare and give you a little more time to practice it as you touch down. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel and leave me comments and feedback. Thank you.